This episode of the CyberWire is made possible in part by Barracuda. Cybercriminals are working overtime. Last year, in the fourth quarter alone, phishing attacks disguised as COVID testing information increased by 521%. Barracuda has identified 13 types of email threats and how cybercriminals use them to steal money from your company or personal information from your employees and customers. Find out about the 13 email threat types and how Barracuda can provide complete email protection for your teams, your customers, and your reputation. Get your free ebook at barracuda.com/cyberwire. That's barracuda.com/cyberwire. Allegations of war crimes and Russian disinformation involving chemical, biological, and radiological weapons. Cyber operations against Russia. GPS interference reported along Finland's border. Conti and its users are still up and active. CISA releases 24 ICS security advisories. Malek Ben Salem from Accenture on deception systems. Our guest is Joe Payne from Code 42 on data exposure. And an extradition in the NetWalker case. From the CyberWire studios at Data Tribe, I'm Dave Bittner with your CyberWire summary for Friday, March 11th, 2022. Ministerial-level talks between Russia and Ukraine this week have made little progress. Russia's talking to Ukraine, something it had said it wouldn't do until Ukraine laid down its arms, but it hasn't backed off from what amounts to a demand for surrender. Euronews quotes Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in a way that suggests how far the Russian view of the situation diverges from what most of the rest of the world regards as reality. Quote, "We do not plan to attack other countries. We did not attack Ukraine either. However, we just explained to Ukraine repeatedly that a situation posed direct security threats to the Russian Federation." End quote. The incident that's attracted considerable attention is the destruction of a maternity hospital in Mariupol, apparently by Russian airstrikes. An op-ed in CNN asks, "If bombing a children's hospital isn't crossing a red line, what is?" And the sentiment it expressed well represents international revulsion the attack has provoked. Russia's response to the general outrage has been instructive. The Kremlin has claimed, first, that the attack never happened, second, that the hospital wasn't actually a hospital but rather a Nazi headquarters, and third, that the attack was committed by Ukrainian forces in an attempt to embarrass Russia, which is running a clean military operation. It's not a war, and it's not, as Foreign Minister Lavrov insisted during talks in Turkey, an invasion either. And complaints of atrocities are just pathetic shrieks from Russia's enemies. Russian disinformation now seems to be playing to a largely domestic audience. It remains to be seen whether it will continue to enjoy success even there. Panelists on a recent Russian talk show had to be brought to heel by the host, the Telegraph reports, for calling the situation in Ukraine worse than Afghanistan, that is, worse for the Russian soldiers. Wired's take on the failure of Russian influence operations abroad is that the invasion of Ukraine was simply too obvious to be obfuscated, and the positive lies told to justify it were too implausible to find any takers beyond a hard core of the already convinced. Facebook has invoked an ongoing conflict exception to its ban on violent speech, The Verge reports. Meta spokesperson Andy Stone told The Verge, quote, "As a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have temporarily made allowances for forms of political expression that would normally violate our rules, like violent speech, such as death to the Russian invaders. We still won't allow credible calls for violence against Russian civilians." End quote. Russia has denounced Facebook's corporate parent, Meta, for extremism. Russian sources continue to push the story that Ukraine had prepared stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, or at least that it was working on acquiring them. The U.S. has called such claims preposterous, as indeed they are, and has taken China to task for amplifying them. Foreign Policy reviews this particular disinformation campaign, which many observers view as setting the stage for Russian use of prohibited weapons. Russian use of chemical weapons is regarded as more likely than either nuclear or biological strikes. In a grisly story that should be received with caution, the Telegraph reports that Russian forces are stockpiling the dead bodies of Ukrainian soldiers killed in action to use in staging some sort of provocation at Chernobyl. Security Scorecard has an account of the distributed denial of service attacks various Ukrainian assets have sustained. They identify 3 distinct DDoS attacks, but say that the attacks appeared to have had a minimal temporary impact on their targets. Government websites and banking services were quickly restored, and customers' balances were not affected. Krebs on Security reports a significant increase in attacks against Ukrainian citizens, mostly phishing attempts, but these are still falling short of the widely anticipated destructive or disruptive attacks Russia had shown itself capable of. Anonymous claims to have successfully gained access to internal files of Roskomnadzor and has leaked 820 gigabytes of data taken from Russia's Information Governance Agency. The files pertain, for the most part, to disinformation and censorship operations. The International Business Times says that the leaks deal primarily with Roskomnadzor's efforts to keep people from calling Russia's invasion of Ukraine an invasion. Russian defense firm Rostec has, according to Bleeping Computer, shut down its website after sustaining a distributed denial of service attack. Finland's Transport and Communications Agency, Traficom, reports observing unusual interference with GPS signals near the country's eastern border, Bleeping Computer writes. The source of the interference is unknown, but Russia has a record of GPS interference and shares a border with Finland. The Conti ransomware gang hasn't, it appears, been significantly impeded by the recent doxing it received at the hands of a Ukrainian researcher who infiltrated its chats. The U.S. government updated its Conti alert on Wednesday, and researchers at Abnormal Security have reported finding Conti's gangland parent Wizard Spider using website contact forms to distribute Bazaar Loader to their targets. Contact forms represent an alternative to the more customary emails. The U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency released 24 industrial control system advisories yesterday. See our daily news briefing on our website for details of the affected systems. CBC reports that Sébastien Vachon Desjardins, formerly a Canadian civil servant, has been extradited to the U.S. to face charges in connection with NetWalker ransomware. The U.S. Justice Department says the indictment charges him with conspiracy to commit computer fraud and wire fraud, intentional damage to a protected computer, and transmitting a demand in relation to damaging a protected computer arising from his alleged participation in a sophisticated form of ransomware known as NetWalker. NetWalker ransomware has targeted dozens of victims all over the world, including companies, municipalities, hospitals, law enforcement, emergency services, school districts, colleges, and universities. Attacks have specifically targeted the healthcare sector during the COVID-19 pandemic, taking advantage of the global crisis to extort victims. The alleged perpetrator is, of course, presumed innocent of the U.S. charges until such time as he may be convicted at trial. Not so up north of the border, where he already copped a plea to mischief in relation to computer data, extortion, and participating in a criminal organization. He was granted a 7-year sabbatical in a Canadian correctional institution. Now the Yankees get their crack at him. And now, a word from our sponsor, Recorded Future. Staying one step ahead of the rapidly evolving threat landscape requires a constant flow of daily intelligence. To stay up to date on everything happening in the world of cybersecurity, join over 50,000 other security professionals who subscribe to the Cyber Daily. With daily email updates on the latest cybersecurity news, top threat actors, exploited vulnerabilities, suspicious IP addresses, and more, the Cyber Daily is the first thing security professionals check every morning. To learn more and subscribe for free, go to recordedfuture.com/cyber-daily. And we thank Recorded Future for sponsoring our show. Insider risk security firm Code 42 recently released the latest edition of their annual Data Exposure Report, highlighting risks organizations face with cloud technologies and insider risks. Joe Payne is president and CEO at Code 42.
In our survey, 98% of those surveyed are concerned with the increased levels of turnover, and rightly so, because the data also shows that when an employee quits, there's a 1 in 3 chance, or a 37% chance to be specific, that the company loses important intellectual property. Now, 60% of employees admit that they took data from their last job to help them in their current job. And our survey, that 37% number, shows that data is actually really important information for a company. So while employees are taking data and emitting data, the other thing that our survey shows is that 71% of respondents said they don't know what and or how much sensitive data departing employees take with them to other companies. So you've got this huge migration of people leaving companies. They tend to stay in the same industry. They take critical information, and our cybersecurity industry really hasn't responded yet with the tools and the technology to protect companies from that.
So what are organizations to do to have better control over this?
Well, there's a category of software that's emerging called insider risk management. And it's really more than software. It's a category around how do we build a program to help our employees think about data differently. And it starts with what we call the 3 T's. So the first is transparency. The first thing is the cybersecurity team needs to actually inform the organization, hey, these are things we care about. We are watching the store. We are looking for people that are exfiltrating data, particularly as they leave an organization. So being transparent is super important. And that sounds kind of obvious, except it's not for cybersecurity people. Cybersecurity people are used to not letting their adversaries know their methods and practices. And in this case, it's the one area in cyber where you really want to let your quote-unquote adversary, because your adversaries are actually your teammates and your employees, know exactly what you're doing. The second T is training. Training means explaining to the organization and to employees, both upfront and then in real time when they make mistakes, what they're allowed to do with data and how they're allowed to take it. So when an employee moves something to their Gmail account and emails it to themselves, or they move it to their Gmail account to email to a colleague because maybe they couldn't get into the mail system on the weekend, and so they just sent it from their Gmail. We need to immediately educate them and train them, hey, that we don't use Gmail for corporate data. Because, once a file gets into a Gmail, that user has that forever. Likewise, we don't use Dropbox. We might use OneDrive or Box or G Drive for corporate purposes, but we're not going to use Dropbox. So that training is super critical. It even includes new employees. When you join our organization, we do not want you to bring data from your prior job. So it starts literally when people come into your organization. And then the last T of the 3 T's is technology. You really need technology that watches sort of the modern way that employees exfiltrate data. And that technology looks for things that are moving through cloud, things that move through AirDrop, but it watches that employee data movement through the lens of allowing it to happen. And the reason this modern technology takes this approach is security teams cannot get in the way of collaboration. And we are using all these cloud-based collaboration tools to work remotely, to work more efficiently, to be better at our jobs. And the security team cannot get in the way of that. The new way of doing this in technology is to watch it, to score behavior, and then to course correct employees as necessary. But it's not to block all the use of cloud or block the use of collaboration tools. So those are the 3 T's: transparency, training, and technology that you need for an insider risk program.
That's Joe Payne from Code 42. There's a lot more to this conversation. If you want to hear more, head on over to CyberWire Pro and sign up for Interview Selects, where you get access to this and many more extended interviews. And now, a word from our sponsor, SpyCloud. SpyCloud constantly recovers and analyzes new data from the criminal underground, a realm packed with credentials, personal information, passwords, and customer information exposed in third-party data breaches, combo lists, and malware infections. With SpyCloud, you now have access to this data that historically has not been available and can take preventative efforts to defend your business against costly cyber attacks and hard-to-detect fraud that can negatively impact your bottom line and brand reputation. Visit spycloud.com/cyberwire to learn how to make recaptured data your best defense. That's spycloud.com/cyberwire. And we thank SpyCloud for sponsoring our show. And I'm pleased to be joined once again by Malek Ben Salem. She is the Technology Research Director for Security at Accenture. Malek, it's always great to have you back. You and I spoke recently about this notion of deception systems, and I wanted to dig in and get a few more details about that.
Yeah, so I think there are some considerations to think about when deploying these deception systems to gather more information about how attackers behave. First, these systems have to be designed with three principles in mind. The first one is believability, or if you will, fidelity to a real-world system. These systems are much more believable if they are very similar, if they look similar to a real production environment. So that notion of fidelity or believability is important. The second principle is isolation. You want these systems to some extent isolated from real-world systems. And I can explain why I'm saying to some extent and not fully isolated. But I think that that's an important distinction. And then the third principle is cost. Obviously, you don't want to mimic your full or to double your infrastructure, right? You want to deploy infrastructure that is realistic, but you don't want to double your costs. So I think cost is also another aspect when designing these deception systems.
Well, let's dig into some of the details of that. I mean, you mentioned you're not having it completely separated from the real system. Why is that?
So defining the isolation boundaries is very important. In some extent, obviously, you don't want to this boundary to be permeable between your real system and this deception system. But you want these systems to be discoverable. You want to tie them to some extent to your company or to your organization so that they're discoverable, so that the adversary coming after you can discover them. But you don't want to put them out there on the internet without any connection to you, without any connection to anything else. You don't want to deploy them inside your environment totally so that you only detect the attack when the attacker is within your environment. You want to deploy them, juxtapose them, if you will, or deploy them adjacently to your environment and have them be discovered. And one way to have them be discovered is to direct some of the real traffic coming to your real world system to this deception system. So that's one way of reducing your costs, right? You don't have to generate, you make them discoverable. You have them have some real world traffic while they're isolated from your environment, but not fully isolated. So there's that connection where you can direct some of the traffic to them. And actually one clever way of doing this in a secure manner is through something called honey patching, right? Where you patch, you make sure that all the patches are deployed within your real environment, right, for known vulnerabilities, but that the patches are not deployed within the deception environment. And then the traffic that's coming to your patch environment can be redirected to that deception environment. And the attacker can take advantage of that vulnerability, exploit that vulnerability in the deception environment, and you can start collecting information about how the attacker is behaving within that environment.
How do you go about funneling the attackers to the appropriate environment?
So that's where those techniques we talked about in the previous segment we had, like software-defined networking, would help. Right, you can direct that traffic to the new environment through those techniques, through the proper network segmentation.
So you're relying on the fact that you can detect that they are someone who is up to no good and send them where you want them to go?
No, you're not necessarily detecting that upfront. You're just deciding that, perhaps some of the traffic should go here. I mean, you can make some assumptions. If traffic is coming from certain IP addresses, for instance, that are more suspicious, then you may want to do that. But it's not 100%, valid assumption.
I see. How do you balance the risk reward here? I mean, I could imagine some people, hearing this and saying, that sounds risky to me, Malek. Cross-pollinating this traffic. What's your response to that?
This is assuming that your real deployment is secure, right? That you have the right defenses or defense layers deployed in your real environment. So that is secure. But this other environment that is not secure is only there for the purpose of gathering more information about the attacker and how they are behaving.
All right. Well, Malek Ben Salem, thanks for joining us. Thanks to all of our sponsors for making this CyberWire possible, especially our supporting sponsor, Arctic Wolf. End cyber risk for your organization with the Arctic Wolf Security Operations Cloud and Concierge Security Model. Learn more at arcticwolf.com/cyberwire. And that's the CyberWire. For links to all of today's stories, check out our daily briefing at thecyberwire.com. Be sure to check out this weekend's edition of Research Saturday and my conversation with John DiMaggio from Analyst One. We're discussing their research report that chronicles the rise and fall of our evil. That's Research Saturday. Check it out. The CyberWire podcast is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technologies. Our amazing CyberWire team is Elliot Peltzman, Trey Hester, Brandon Karpf, Eliana White, Peru Prakash, Justin Sabi, Tim Nodar, Joe Kerrigan, Carol Terrio, Ben Yellen, Nick Valecki, Gina Johnson, Bennett Moe, Chris Russell, John Petrick, Jennifer Iben, Rick Howard, Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next week. And now, a word from our sponsor, Code 42. Did you know that there's a 1 in 3 chance that your company will lose IP when an employee quits? Cybersecurity teams are facing unprecedented challenges when it comes to protecting sensitive corporate data from exposure, leak, and theft. The annual Data Exposure Report 2022 from Code 42 revealed 3 key trends that are accelerating insider risk. First, the continued adoption of cloud technologies and a lack of visibility into them. Second, the impact of the Great Resignation and departing employees' theft of IP and sensitive data. And third, the challenges of the new hybrid remote workforce and uncertainty over how to address it. As insider risk grows, Code 42's insider risk management approach helps protect data without slowing down business. Learn more at code42.com/showme. And we thank Code 42 for sponsoring our show.